Chapter 42 of Captain Bill McDonald, Texas Ranger, A Story of Frontier Reform. This is a LibraryVox recording. All LibraryVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibraryVox.org. This is read by Daniel Grant Peterson. Captain Bill McDonald, Texas Ranger, A Story of Frontier Reform, by Albert Bigelow Paine. The end of rangering and a new appointment. State Revenue Agent of Texas, the full rendition bill enforced. A great battle and bloodless triumph. The Rio Grande affair was Captain Bill's last ranger service of dramatic importance. He was continuously busy during the 2 months that elapsed between that episode and his official retirement. But it was only in the usual line of duty, chasing murderers, putting down riot, and disarming unruly men. The things he had done so often that to look back on his career now was to gaze down a kaleidoscopic vista of death and disorder, a whirling maze of bad men and guns. It was in January 1907 that he went to Belleville as a witness in a murder case, and while he was there January 16th that Governor T.M. Campbell, who had just succeeded Governor Linham, appointed him State Revenue Agent of Texas. Captain Bill's first knowledge of the matter came to him through the morning paper at Belleville. When his duties were over there, he set out for Austin to inquire into it. He knew that a state revenue agent was appointed to keep a general supervision over the collection of state revenues, taxes, license money, and the like. But he had only a dim idea to the specific duties of the office. He was by no means certain that he wanted to exchange the wide, free life of rangering, whatever might be its drawbacks, for the routine duties of an office in the capital, with a desk, a revolving chair, and a stenographer, where might be the comforts or prerequisites of these things. He was no longer a young man, and he had been shot through from different directions. Desperate wounds, long, hard vigils, cold, and exposure had left him weather-beaten and with shoulders and chest no longer as full and erect as in the old days. Yet his eye was just as clear, his ear as alert, and his nerve as steady as in the beginning, as if this appointment was merely and sincere reward for deeds performed, a sort of official manifest that he was down and out. He would have none of it. He could wear out, and he might some day stop a conclusive bullet, but he declined to rust out. Perhaps there was a pretty general belief in Texas that Captain McDonald's appointment was, in fact, sincere. But if so, the idea was transient. Arriving at the state capitol, he called on Governor Campbell without delay. "How about this appointment, Governor?" he said. "What kind of job is it?" "Well, it's a better job than you got, Captain. The pay is better, and it's safer, too. You're going to die or be killed someday about in all kinds of weather and getting shot at from ambush. We can't afford to lose you just yet." "Thank you, Governor. I don't want to be lost either," Captain Bill said in a gentle drawl. "But I don't know as I can fill the bill. What do I have to do as state revenue agent anyway? No chance to handle a gun, is there? I can do that about as well as anything." Governor Campbell laughed and handed Bill a copy of the statute. "There's the law on the subject," he said. "You'll find all the information you need right there." Captain Bill took the book and spent several days reading and rereading whatever he could find bearing on the matter of tax paying. Also on the duties of tax assessors and tax gatherers in general, and on those of the state revenue agent in particular. He found that he knew a good deal on the subject, after all, not in technical detail perhaps, but fundamentally and vitality. In his wide general knowledge of the conditions prevailing in every portion of the state, he knew that the poorest counties, those least able to bear the burden, carried a disproportionate load of state expenses. He had never given the matter much consideration before, taking it for granted that in a new county and a poor county, taxes could not help being high. This was true, no doubt, but he saw clearly enough now that in such counties taxes have been by far too high all along, and that the full rendition law provided a remedy for just that thing. Captain Bill had but one idea about law, which was that it must be enforced. To enforce the law would be interesting and righteous. He went back to Governor Campbell. "Governor," he said, "I think this job will suit me pretty well, if I can run it my way." "Well, Captain, that was what you were appointed for." "Governor," Captain Bill proceeded, "there are some of our counties and people paying twice as much tax as they ought to, and some of them, the ones that ought to pay most, and their railroads and corporations, are not paying half enough." Governor Campbell nodded. "How would you rectify that, Captain?" he asked. "Well, you see, the tax rate is the same for all counties, and the poor counties provide for their own home expenses, have asses on high valuation in order to make amount big enough to go around, while the rich counties that are practically out of debt assess on a low valuation, sometimes not more than a fourth of the value of the property. That might be all right if it was only the home levy that counted, but you see, the state levy assessed on the same valuation as the home levy, and the result is that the county that is in debt paying the state taxes and valuation about twice or three times as big as those big rich counties that have had the most benefit from the state and are best able to pay for it. Why, those old rich counties get an allowance of school money from the state that is actually more than all the taxes they turn in. Now, the way to fix that is to make all the counties' assess exactly alike on full valuation. Now, and get the state levy down where it belongs to state expense fairly appropriated. The full rendition bill provides clearly for this case and ought to be enforced." Governor Campbell looked thoughtful. He foresaw the storm that a man with the convictions and determination of Bill McDonald could stir up in a state like Texas. Presently he said, "Well, Captain, that was what the full rendition bill was passed for, but it's been considered a dead letter so far." "It won't be a dead letter if I take the job, Governor. It will be the liveliest letter in the statute book for a while." Campbell smiled grimly. In imagination he already heard the howl that would go up and the imprecations that would descend upon the appointer as well as appointee. After all, perhaps a ranger captain in a job like that was not in perfect selection. Then presently he turned to Captain Bill. "Well, Captain, you've got your appointment," he said. The state revenue agent lost no time in beginning his work. Already many of the annual assessments for 1907 had been made, and if any reassessments were to be taken, there was no time to lose. In 1906, the assessed values of Texas properties had exaggerated $1,210,000,000. State Agent McDonald resolved that they should properly be more than doubled this amount, and he undertook at once the first step in that direction. He did this knowing full well what would result. He knew that a man's purse is his tenderest point, and that to lay a finger on his taxes is to touch a spot already sore. He knew that what he was about to do meant to antagonize practically every corporation in the state and every rich county as a whole. Also, perhaps a majority of the press. Papers that had laundered him to disguise for his achievements would be the first to belittle him. Now, to cry him down, what he was undertaking was distinctly a minority crusade, a struggle for the pioneer, a fight for the underdog. Yet, I think his chief consideration was the enforcement of the law. That would be likely to be so. The law's enforcement had been his habit so long. If other things weighed at all, they probably only added zest to his resolve. He began by issuing a general letter to assessors throughout the state, and part of the letter ran, "Dear Sir, as state revenue agent with well-defined duties imposed upon me, I feel called upon to communicate with tax assessors relative to the rendition and assessment of real and personal property for taxation. An inspection of the tax rolls of your county for 1906 and some years prior thereto discloses the fact the real and personal property is assessed at only a certain percentage of its value instead of at its value, as required by the Constitution and laws of the state. I will take occasion during the year to visit such counties as may be practical and examine into the mode of rendition and assessment, and I hope to have your assistance." The letter then called attention to and quoted from the law setting forth the duties which good officers and citizens would perform in full, and the penalties for being and doing otherwise. Near the end the letter he said, "This duty imposed upon you by the law, and I suppose I am not presumptuous in asking you to follow it strictly so that there will be no embarrassment when I call upon the purpose of making an investigation," etc., etc. It was a careful, dignifying letter, entirely justified by its conditions. It is true the revenue agent did not fully explain in that last clause just what would be likely to cause the embarrassment when he appeared upon the scene for the purpose of making an investigation, and the thoughtful assessor who had followed Bill McDonald's career and remembered some of his former investigations may have inferred that it would have something to do with guns. Certainly that letter made those assessors mad. Also, it made the people mad, and the newspapers. Even the people and the newspapers of the counties that would benefit by the full rendition law, not quite understanding at first, got mad as a preparation for further enlightenment. Never since Joseph laid a 20% levy on the Egyptians after first taking away all their land was there such a general madness over any tax order under the sun. In all the history of Texas, there had been no such commotion, such a cyclone of indigestion as that which had its storm center in the state revenue agent's office at Austin. Since Bowie and Travis, a fit successor to those heroes of the Alamo, now denounced him as a bloodthirsty desperado who proposed to hold up the people of Texas as he had held up bad men at the point of a six-shooter. They declared that his sole purpose was to fill the state treasury to bursting with the people's money, so that it might be an easy prey for grafters already lying in wait with schemes. Then they denounced Governor Campbell for appointing such a man and prophesied his political ruin and general downfall. Some of them could not, and others would not, see that a full assessment for all was the only fair system, and that the values increased, the general rate of levy would lower accordingly. Not so blind as those who will not see in property owners, public and private, in counties where assessments had long been far too low to give them a fair share of the state burdens, were naturally blinded by that self-interest which was stirred in with Adam's dust. Indignation meetings prevailed. Assessors elected by the people told their constituents that they would obey the will of the people and tell any petty revenue agent that he could go to with his bluff that the people of Texas were bigger than any individual in it and knew what they wanted in the way of assessments, regardless of any fool laws to the contrary. Perhaps the coolest man in the state sat in the state revenue agent's office at Austin and smiled that bland, winning smile of his as he greeted the reporters and declined to get mad or to recede from his position, merely referring them to the law as set down, dictating between times answers to excited assessors in which he assured them that his first letter was quite genuine and meant what it said, and that furthermore, if they had, as some of them stated, already turned in their assessment rolls for 1907, they must go back and do it again, observing the law both in letter and spirit in order to avoid that little embarrassment when he should call somewhat later in the year. And this kicked up the dust worse than ever. There was, however, a percentage of public sentiment in favor of the law and justice, regardless of personal interest. There were men in high places who stood boldly for the new order of assessment, and there were newspapers, even in the old rich counties, that for a principle were willing to lose subscribers and pay the additional tax besides. The names of these men and of those newspapers Texas should inscribe on a roll of honor in her state capital, for it was by such those that some 70 years ago her independence was won. Governor Campbell assailed on every side, breasted the storm, and stood firm. If his political structure must go down to ruin because of an effort to secure justice and the enforcement of the statute as laid down, then perhaps the ruin would be better off than the edifice. He discussed the matter thoughtfully and earnestly, here and there, when called upon, and was listened to with respect through with uncertain approval. Other officials throughout the state were inclined to be governed by the temper of their constitutions. Yet there were notable exceptions. In February 1907, at a convention of county judges in Dallas, the statement was made that an attempt to carry out the instructions of the state revenue agents in the matter of the full rendition law would mean the political death of such county judges or commissioners as engaged in that effort. This statement through wide was not general. Among others to dissent was Judge Hill of Eastland County, who declared that if the people of Texas did not want a man in office who would carry out the law, he, for one, would be glad to resign. That was a fine, brave statement and had its effect. A resolution pledging the members of the association individually and as a whole to support and maintain the letter and spirit of the full rendition law to the end that the taxes of the entire state might be equal and uniform, was unanimously adopted. The right word from the right source had been spoken. It began to be echoed in public places. It was along in March 1907 that the state revenue agent decided that he would not wait to call on the assessors during the year, but that he would gather them in Austin where he could talk to them all together. A meeting of the State Association of Assessors near the end of the month was the result. The assessors came together in many frames of mind, but mainly belligerent. Some of them had given it out to their constitutions before they started that they were going down to tell that old ranger that he might be able to round up cattle thieves and Mexicans, but that bunch of county assessors would be a different matter. With these officials began to collect around the Capitol, there were plenty of talk, not always complimentary. The state revenue agent loafed around among them. It was noticeable how criticism subsided in the various groups as he saturated in their direction. It was rumored that, though a civil officer, that he still wore a .45 in a holster and carried an automatic in his hip pocket. When the members were finally assembled in general meeting, and Captain Bill rose to address them, they were quite still. He did not make a long speech, but was to the point. We have been assessing in this go-as-you-please sort of fashion a good while, he said. And now we are going to do it the other way. We have been assessing by custom. Now we're going to do it by law. The present tax rate is 20 cents on the 100. We want it to get it down to 5 cents on the 100 and adjust it so that every man will pay what he should, no more and no less. I don't want to pay out money any more than the next one, but I want to pay what is right, and I know you men want to do what is right with your people. When you find out what the right thing is, this law is right, and just because we've been going according to the old unjust custom, there's no reason now why we shouldn't be according to the old and just law. It was in this strain that he talked to them, using the friendly, familiar vernacular which meant sincerity and a genuine interest in their welfare. They saw that he is in earnest, and he spoke to their better inclination. Also, he had the strong side of the argument. A paper commenting on the matter said, "Thrice was the captain armed for the reason that he was in the right, and had the laws of the state to back him. A statement true in the main, though it leaves the reader to guess what the third way the captain was thought to be armed. At all events, whatever rebellion may have existed must have been pretty well quieted by the next day, for the following resolution was unanimously adopted. Resolved, that we, the assessors of the state of Texas, in convention assembled, will make what improvements we possibly can to increase the renditions of 1907, and promise fully comply with the law. and the assessments of the future, and we hereby authorize the Secretary of this Convention to notify all assessors not present to cooperate with us in this matter. Footnote: The New York Sun, commenting on this, said, "Many of the assessors came to Austin with a feeling of ominosity toward Captain McDonald, but he brought them all into line, and before the meeting adjourned, resolutions were unanimously adopted thanking him for taking up the question of assessments and promising to assess property at its full market value." End of footnote. When that association disbanded, if there's any indignation and resentment existing for the state revenue agent, it made no outward manifestation. One assessor said, "As to what my duty was, I very well knew that before I went to Austin, but like most other assessors, I followed a custom instead of the law. When a change was demanded, I thought it would cause a great deal of confusion among the people who had made an inventory of their property. I find it not the case. I have very little trouble, and in my judgment I will get 40% raise for an average." And another assessor, writing to the Fort Worth Record, said, "Well, I'm going to my duty. I am swearing to every man to its value of his property as well as to the rendering of it, so when Brother McDonald comes around, if he ever does, there will be no kick coming my way." The result came when the inventories were gathered and the items footed. Between the figures of 1906 and 1907, there was an actual difference of $414,137,246 in favor of the latter year. As part of the vast increase would come from the natural property growth of the state, but in the main was due to the revised inventories and valuations. And this was a mere beginning undertaken under distributing the adverse conditions. The increase of 1908 over 1907 added another total of $561,297,248 to the property assessment values, aggravating an increase over the year of 1906 of $975,434,494. Perhaps Texas will be a $3 billion state yet, and has been prophesied, and the tax rate of the pioneer counties will be such as to encourage still further settlement and progress. Not that the system is perfect yet. There are still assessors who would shirk their duty, and hence counties who default in their burdens. No great reform can be immediately complete, but if State Revenue Agent McDonald survives long enough, this one will be so in time, and already it stands as its greatest monument and victory. Footnote: In addition to this work, State Revenue Agent McDonald has very largely increased the state income by a systematic and vigorous enforcing of the law, providing for the licensing of various public entertainments, and for regulating the sale of liquors. His experience in putting into effect the new Baskin-McGregor law somewhat resembled his adventures with the full rendition law, and ended with as a single victory. In a footnote. Full rendition of property values for the purposes of taxation had always been the law in Texas. The 13th legislators provided for the reestablishment of an old and dishonored system. For a fuller understanding of the conditions before and after the enforcement of this and other laws, the reader may refer to Governor Campbell's message of January 1909, Appendix F, and the address by Hun W. D. Williams, Appendix G, at the end of this volume. End of Chapter 42.